Hey, this is Paulius, and you're listening to Voices of Table Rounds. This episode will focus on making connections in MedEd to individuals in our community who contribute to our learning and help us grow as educators. Today we have Dhruv Srinivasachar. Welcome to the podcast, Dhruv, and for those who don't know you already, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, my name's Dhruv Srinivasachar. I am a soon-to-be intern at Western Michigan University School of Medicine in Combined Medicine and Pediatrics, and am about to graduate from Virginia Commonwealth University's School of Medicine.
We're always looking for new ways to learn medicine online, and would love to pick your brain about any of your favorite podcasts or social media accounts that you follow as part of your MedEd routine.
I would be remiss if I did not mention the podcast / online sensation that sort of got me into this role, which is the Clinical Problem Solvers. Just to sort of give you a little bit of background on me, I started med school about 5 years ago. I had taken a year because I had initially thought I was going to do basic research and graduate work, but then I decided that the clinic was more for me, so I came back. And one of the things that I was introduced to near the very tail end of my third year, was the Clinical Problem Solvers podcast. And right at the time that COVID hit, they had, started this virtual morning report to give people the opportunity to be able to present cases when institutional morning reports were being taken offline. And they have kept that virtual morning report going strong for the past year or so. And it's grown very widely to a point where now there are specific days where it originally started off as an internal medicine type of morning report. There have been specific days now that are set aside for teaching neurology. There is a specific day for students to be able to practice clinical reasoning. And just recently they started a clinical reasoning day for non-native speakers of English. And they have been one of the biggest players in the whole space of MedEd. In terms of other podcasts that I follow, the duo of the Curbsiders and Cribsiders podcasts, the Cribsiders especially I have a lot of love for, given the fact that the vast majority of their crew are med-peds like me, and a whole bunch more. Peds on Call, actually, is another interesting podcast put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics that talks a lot about pediatric-specific issues. In terms of social media accounts, the great Dr. Bob Centaur is on Twitter, the creator of the Centaur score for figuring out whether or not people have strep pharyngitis that needs to be treated. And he's also started his own virtual evening report, if you will, called Unremarkable Labs. And then I guess the other thing that has been a big part of my MedEd routine is more MedEd in other languages. I'd mentioned the Clinical Problem Solvers before, and one of the newer players on the scene is a virtual evening report called Elabore Medicina, which is essentially the Clinical Problem Solvers virtual morning reports, but in Portuguese. And I have been a discussant on one of the episodes and a presenter on another, even though I am certainly not a native Portuguese speaker. That and the multilingual morning report that was started by a fellow soon-to-be med-peds intern named Haley Sharma, who's about to graduate from the University of Minnesota and is going to be starting up at Indiana University.
Oh, that's awesome. I think that's really helpful for us to hear, and we'll put a summary together of the things that you mentioned. And so, since you've obviously been around a lot of influential and well-regarded educators, what's some of the most memorable advice that you've received as a learner?
Most memorable advice that I've received. One is something that I kind of had to figure out for myself, and it was kind of what brought me into this space in the first place. And that is that there are very few decisions that are irreversible. If you see that a pathway is not working for you, like basic research didn't work out for me, it's okay to step away from that path for the moment, and realize that that path is not entirely foreclosed to you. The other big piece of memorable advice, and this one comes from the great Ravi Jeha, who's one of the founders of the Clinical Problem Solvers, is that the three most important words that you can say when you are on rounds, when you are in a morning report, or when you are being asked a question by one of your attendings, the three most important words that you can say if you are struggling to try and figure out what to contribute is, "I don't know." Because that, to a teacher who is discerning enough, gives them the opportunity to be able to start teaching on a subject where you have the opportunity to learn.
That's awesome. I love that. Part of our conversation, we hope to explore also people's take on different innovations in medical education, and you've had some experience with Table Rounds, our medical card game, and would love to hear how you see this game impacting the way you learn medicine and interact with your peers or educators.
I've been involved in the Table Rounds card game, I guess, from the time that I had sort of seen it talked about by some of my classmates who have been involved in it, particularly the other Dhruv in our class, Dhruv Sethi, Adil Asgahi, and others. And when I had first seen the card game, I thought to myself, it's interesting. It's a neat way to try and sort of figure out different ways to think about things. But I've sort of been mostly involved in it more in sort of the virtual space with the Med Twitter Connections recent Twitter challenge that was posted a couple of weeks ago in a couple of Discord sessions. And I think one of the big things that I have found is that this innovation in med ed, it certainly brings people together, and it allows for radically different thinking styles to be able to contribute knowledge that may not necessarily be well known, but also to reinforce teaching points that any well-rounded internist, or to be quite frank, any well-rounded doctor should be able to know.
Really appreciate you sharing that. As we look ahead for things that we wish we had in medical education or things that we hope others create, do you have any ideas about what you would like to see change or be added on to as an available resource for students learning medicine?
I think the big thing for me is that medical education, or at least formal medical education, has not been able to take advantage of the full spectrum of resources that are available in sort of the free and open access med ed world, or the FOMED world as it's known. I think one of the big things that could be done, just as a bit of low-hanging fruit, is to incorporate some of these podcasts, or reading through some of these more extensive tutorials that have been written. And again, just to go back and give another example of a podcast that I've been following, The Curious Clinicians, the podcasts presented by Drs. Tony Brew, Avraham Cooper, and Hannah Abrams, basically take extensive tutorials on some of the more interesting aspects of medicine and essentially ask the question why those aspects are the way that they are. So, for instance, there was a recent episode on what the phenomenon of bendopnea, when patients have heart failure, and specifically heart failure with reduced cardiac index and increased pulmonary arterial pressure, they tend to develop shortness of breath even with just bending down to tie shoes, for instance. Having that, or even just the sort of deep dives into clinical topics that the curbsiders and cribsiders do, or going through cases like the clinical problem solvers do, or even having students participate in the virtual morning reports. Those are all low-hanging fruit that could easily be incorporated into a formal medical education curriculum. And even right now, these podcasts are eligible for continuing medical education credit. And if they're eligible for that, why can they not be eligible for inclusion in a formal med ed curriculum for younger students?
Well said. And I think that widespread adoption of collaborative and game-based learning models is inevitable. I'm really intrigued to see what medical education innovations will make a lasting impact on how we obtain and share medical knowledge. For those who are new to online medical education communities, Do you have any advice for where to get started?
I mean, certainly Twitter is a good way to come into the community, but there are well-known issues with Twitter sometimes being toxic. There's been a decent amount of sort of movement into Instagram as a space, although it doesn't necessarily have the long-form, publishable style threads that can be done in the way that Twitter can. Although it's certainly useful for putting out sort of short-form videos to be able to reach more people. There is one intern who goes by @Leticia Preti, originally from Brazil and about to be an intern at Columbia, and she actually has introduced many people to Twitter through her Instagram and has, given a lot of advice to specifically Brazilian medical graduates who want to apply to residency in the US about how to go about the process. So that's brought a lot of people into the MedEd space. I think the big thing and the space that would probably be the most helpful to exist in, and this is coming from someone who is very much an introvert and only really comes out of his shell in these big spaces, is again, just to go back, the clinical problem solvers, the EMR, and any of the other sort of virtual report spaces. Those spaces are probably the natural extension of Twitter because they allow for actually hearing from the people behind the accounts. My biggest piece of advice for anyone who wants to jump into Twitter is to create a Twitter account, tag #MedTwitter, and you will enter a space that is at once possibly frightening, but ultimately is very rewarding to be a part of.
Really excellent insights, Dhruv. Thank you for your time. We hope you enjoyed our conversation. Stay tuned for our next episode, and in the meantime, keep exploring the hidden connections in medicine and let us know what you find.